January 17, 1945. Luzon, Philippines. 0347 hours. The night hung heavy over the Philippine jungle, thick with moisture and the electric hum of cicadas. In a makeshift command post carved into the volcanic soil, Colonel Takeda Hiroshi sat before a Type 94 radio transmitter, its vacuum tubes glowing amber in the darkness like tiny warning fires. His fingers moved across the Morse key with practiced precision, tapping out coordinates, troop movements, supply requests, the vital arterial flow of information that kept the Imperial Japanese Army alive in these dying days of the Pacific Campaign. Outside, palm fronds whispered secrets to the wind. The colonel did not know that 20,000 feet above him, suspended in the black cathedral of the tropical sky, an American B-24 Liberator had already begun its descent, its bombardier's eyes fixed not on landmarks or maps, but on a glowing needle dancing across a cathode ray screen, a needle that pointed directly at the radio signal emanating from Takeda's fingertips. The war in the Pacific had entered its fourth year, and the technological gap between the Imperial Japanese forces and the American military machine had widened into a chasm that no amount of courage or sacrifice could bridge. Since the tide had turned at Midway in June 1942, Japanese commanders had watched their advantages erode like sand castles before an advancing tide. First went air superiority, then naval dominance, then the island fortresses, one by one, falling like dominoes across the Pacific. But through all these losses, the Japanese officer corps maintained one unshakable article of faith, that the radio, that marvel of modern warfare that allowed commands to traverse mountains and oceans in seconds, remained their reliable servant, their technological advantage over less sophisticated enemies. They had used radio to coordinate the attack on Pearl Harbor. They had used it to orchestrate the lightning conquests of 1941 and 1942, when the rising sun seemed destined to dominate all of Asia. The radio was control. The radio was power. The radio was safety. They could not have been more catastrophically wrong. Colonel Takeda belonged to a generation of Japanese officers who had studied warfare at the feet of European masters, who had learned their craft in the crucible of the war against China, who believed absolutely in the superiority of Japanese fighting spirit combined with modern technology. He had graduated from the Imperial Japanese Army Academy in 1928, when Japan was still ascending, still building, still confident that its destiny was to lead Asia into a new era. He had fought in Manchuria, where Japanese forces had demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of combined arms warfare, where radio coordination had allowed small, mobile units to outmaneuver and destroy larger Chinese formations. The radio had been his ally then, his invisible advantage. When he transmitted, he felt connected to the vast machinery of the empire, felt himself part of something larger and more powerful than any individual soldier. The radio made him invincible. That belief was about to be incinerated in white phosphorus and high explosive. The technology that would kill Takeda and thousands like him had been born in the laboratories of American universities and corporations, refined in the secret workshops of the war effort, perfected through the systematic application of resources that the Japanese Empire could not begin to match. While Japanese engineers struggled with shortages of copper, rubber, and rare earth elements, American factories churned out radar sets, radio direction finders, and electronic warfare equipment by the thousands. The device hunting Colonel Takeda was called APA-38, a radio compass receiver system that could detect and precisely locate radio transmissions from distances of over 100 miles. It transformed every Japanese radio operator from a commander into a beacon, every transmission from a message into a suicide note. The Americans called the technique homing on jam, though there was nothing jamming about what would follow. Only silence, sudden and absolute. Japanese military doctrine had never conceived of such a weapon. In their training, in their tactical manuals, in their understanding of how modern warfare functioned, radio remained a tool of command, not a vulnerability. They had developed codes, certainly, the famous JN-25 naval code that American cryptanalysts had broken before Midway, the various Army codes that grew increasingly desperate as the war progressed. They understood that messages could be intercepted, decrypted, analyzed. But the notion that the very act of transmission, regardless of message content, could become a death sentence. This lay outside their conceptual framework. It was as if the air itself had become hostile, as if speaking aloud could summon lightning from a clear sky. The first Japanese officers to encounter this new American capability died without understanding what had killed them. In the Solomon Islands in late 1943, entire command posts vanished in sudden surgical strikes that arrived minutes after beginning radio transmissions. Japanese commanders attributed these attacks to spies, to Filipino guerrillas with radios of their own, to impossible coincidence. The alternative explanation was too terrible to accept, that the Americans had found a way to turn Japanese technology against itself, to make every radio operator a target, to transform the instrument of command and control into an execution device. Some officers began to suspect, to whisper fears in quiet moments. But the needs of war were relentless, and without radio communication, modern military operations became impossible. So they continued to transmit, continued to coordinate, continued to send invisible signals into the sky, hoping that this time, just this once, the bombs would not follow. They always followed. Colonel Takeda completed his transmission at 0351 hours. The message had taken 4 minutes to send. For minutes during which the N/APA-38 receiver aboard the B-24 had refined its bearing, during which the navigator had plotted the intersection of multiple readings, during which the bombardier had prepared his payload and set the arming switches. The bombs were M47A2 incendiaries, white phosphorus bombs that burned at over 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt steel, to ignite flesh, to turn a jungle command post into a crematorium in seconds. They fell in a stick of 12, tumbling through the humid darkness, fins stabilizing their trajectory, fuses counting down the seconds until impact. The whistle of their descent cut through the night sounds, a rising shriek that gave Takeda perhaps 3 seconds of comprehension, 3 seconds to understand that his faith in technology had betrayed him, 3 seconds to know the future before it arrived in fire. The explosions walked across the command post with mechanical precision, each burst following the last at exact intervals, creating a carpet of flame that left nothing alive, nothing intact, nothing but scorched earth and burning fragments. The Type 94 radio transmitter, that object of Takeda's trust and the instrument of his death, melted into slag within the first half-second of the attack. The colonel himself was immolated so quickly that his nervous system never registered pain, only a flash of impossible heat, and then nothing, not even time for fear. His staff officers, his radio operators, his guards, 27 men in total, died with him, their final moments spent in confusion, unable to comprehend how the Americans had found them in the vast darkness of the Philippine jungle, unable to understand that they had killed themselves with every word they transmitted into the waiting sky. 20 miles away, in another concealed position, Major Yamashita, Kenji, heard the distant crump of the explosions and felt ice crystallize in his stomach. Takeda's post had been well hidden, carefully camouflaged, positioned to avoid aerial observation. Yet the Americans had struck it with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, at night, in weather that should have grounded their aircraft. Yamashita looked at his own radio set, at the glowing tubes that suddenly seemed less like tools and more like eyes, watching, betraying, marking him for death. He had a message that needed transmission, orders from division headquarters that required acknowledgement. But his finger hesitated over the Morse key, hovering like a man at the edge of an abyss, unable to step forward, unable to step back. If he transmitted, would the bombs come for him too? If he maintained radio silence, would his unit be cut off, left to wither without supplies or reinforcement or coordination? This paralysis, this terrible choice between death by action and death by inaction, represented a new dimension in warfare, one that the Japanese military had no doctrine to address. For centuries, military theory had grappled with problems of maneuver, firepower, morale, logistics, tangible, comprehensible challenges that could be analyzed and countered. But what defense existed against a weapon that turned your own communications into a targeting beacon? What tactics could overcome an enemy who could see your invisible transmissions as clearly as smoke signals? The Americans had weaponized the electromagnetic spectrum itself, had transformed radio waves from a neutral medium into hostile territory. Every transmission became a calculated risk, every message a potential death warrant. And because modern warfare demanded constant communication, demanded the coordination that radio alone could provide, Japanese officers found themselves trapped in an impossible dilemma: transmit and die, or maintain silence and watch your forces disintegrate into isolated, ineffective fragments. Yamashita made his choice. He would transmit, but briefly, 30 seconds, no more. He would send his message in compressed, abbreviated code, would reduce the window of vulnerability to the absolute minimum. Perhaps the Americans would not have time to locate him. Perhaps their direction-finding aircraft were too far away, too occupied with other targets. Perhaps fortune would favor the brave, as the samurai code insisted it must. He took a breath, composed his message in his mind, and began to transmit. 18 minutes later, the bombs arrived. The pattern repeated itself across the Pacific Theater throughout 1944 and into 1945, a technological massacre that Japanese forces were powerless to prevent. In the Philippines, in Burma, in the East Indies, in the scattered island garrisons that still held out against American advance, wherever Japanese forces operated, wherever they needed to communicate, the American radio direction finding systems found them and marked them for destruction. The statistics, compiled by American intelligence after the war, revealed the devastating effectiveness of the technique. An estimated 847 Japanese command posts destroyed through radio homing attacks between October 1944 and August 1945. Over 3,200 Japanese officers killed, including 47 regimental commanders and 8 generals. Entire divisions rendered leaderless, their command structures decapitated in sudden, surgical strikes that seemed to arrive from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. Japanese forces attempted countermeasures with the desperation of men drowning. Some units reverted to courier systems, sending runners with written messages through jungle and mountain terrain, a method that reduced communication speed from seconds to hours or days, fatally slowing decision-making in a war that moved at the speed of aircraft and mechanized columns. Other units tried transmitting from multiple locations simultaneously, hoping to confuse American direction finders through sheer multiplication of signals, a tactic that succeeded only in providing more targets and getting more radio operators killed. The most sophisticated Japanese response involved the development of highly directional antennas that focused transmissions into narrow beams, reducing the area from which signals could be intercepted. But these systems required extensive setup time, precise alignment with distant receivers, and engineering expertise that the depleted, exhausted Japanese forces increasingly lacked. And even when these measures worked, they could only delay the inevitable, could only by minutes or hours before American technology adapted and overwhelmed whatever temporary advantage had been gained. What terrified Japanese officers most profoundly was not the technology itself, but what it represented about American industrial and scientific capability. The radio direction finding systems were only one element of a vast technological apparatus that included radar, sonar, proximity fuses, electronic encryption and decryption, guided weapons, and dozens of other innovations that gave American forces overwhelming advantages in every dimension of warfare. Japanese soldiers had been taught that spirit could overcome material disadvantage, that the warriors will mattered more than the scientists' formulas. They had been raised on stories of samurai who had defeated larger, better-equipped enemies through courage and tactical brilliance. But courage offered no defense against bombs that followed radio signals. Willpower could not jam radar or decrypt codes or match the production capacity of American factories. The war in the Pacific had become a demonstration of cold, mathematical superiority. Resources multiplied by technology, applied with systematic efficiency, grinding Japanese resistance into atomic dust. In the final accounting of the Pacific War, the radio direction finding attacks represented a single thread in a vast tapestry of American technological and industrial dominance, unremarkable in the context of atomic weapons and thousand-plane bomber raids, but devastating in their cumulative impact on Japanese command and control. The terrified Japanese officers, their fingers hovering over Morse keys that might summon death, became symbols of a larger truth about modern warfare. That victory increasingly belonged not to the bravest or most disciplined soldiers, but to whichever society could most effectively harness science and industry for military purposes. The glowing tubes of the Type 94 transmitter, trusted servant transformed into lethal betrayer, illuminated this truth with harsh and unforgiving light. The electromagnetic spectrum had become battleground, and Japan had arrived to that battlefield with tools designed for an earlier, simpler war. The young Japanese radio operators who died in those sudden, terrible strikes were not cowards or fools. They were soldiers doing their duty, operating the best equipment their nation could provide, following tactical doctrine that had seemed sound when the war began. Their error was to trust in technology without understanding its vulnerabilities, to believe that possession of modern equipment meant mastery of modern warfare. They learned, too late and at fatal cost, that American engineers and scientists had advanced beyond mere possession into weaponization, had found ways to transform the enemy's own tools into guidance systems for precision death. The radio waves that Japanese commanders thought of as invisible servants turned out to be visible signposts, glowing pathways leading directly to their positions, invitations written in electromagnetic radiation that American bombers could read as clearly as highway signs. The legacy of those terrified moments, the paralysis before transmission, the countdown after transmission ends, the waiting for bombs that might or might not come, extended far beyond the Pacific War itself. In every subsequent conflict, in every modern military force, the lessons learned through Japanese suffering became doctrine. Secure your communications, minimize transmission time, use directional antennas, employ frequency hopping, encrypt everything. Assume the enemy is listening. Assume the enemy can locate you. Assume that every radio signal might be the last thing you ever send. The fear that gripped Japanese radio operators in 1945 became the standard operational reality for all military communications in all wars that followed. A permanent transformation of how soldiers understood and used the technology that connected them to their armies, their missions, their chances of survival. And somewhere in that transformation, in that recognition that communication itself had become a vulnerability, lay a deeper truth about the nature of modern warfare and the societies that wage it. The Americans had not simply built better radios or more sophisticated bombs. They had systematically analyzed every dimension of warfare, had applied scientific method to the problem of how to kill efficiently and at scale, had industrialized death with the same ruthless optimization they brought to automobile production and electrical distribution. The Japanese, for all their courage and discipline and cultural emphasis on warrior values, had entered the war with an incomplete understanding of what modern industrial warfare actually required, not just brave soldiers and competent officers, but research universities and electronics laboratories and engineering programs and manufacturing capacity and resource extraction and all the vast, unglamorous infrastructure that turned scientific discoveries into deployed weapons. The radio direction finding attacks were merely one manifestation of this fundamental disparity, one example among thousands of American technological edges that accumulated into overwhelming advantage. Colonel Takeda, Major Yamashita, Lieutenant Nakamura, and the thousands of other Japanese radio operators who died in those attacks were casualties not just of American bombs, but of this larger failure. The failure to build the kind of society that could compete in total industrial war against an enemy with superior resources, superior technology, and superior organizational capability. They paid with their lives for decisions made in Tokyo decades earlier, when Japanese leaders chose rapid military expansion over sustained scientific and industrial development, when short-term conquest took priority over long-term capability building. The glowing tubes of their Type 94 transmitters illuminated not just their immediate positions, but the deeper darkness of strategic miscalculation, of a war undertaken without adequate understanding of what victory would actually require. In the end, the electromagnetic spectrum, neutral, mathematical, indifferent to human ideology, rendered its verdict with the finality of physics. The radio waves propagated according to Maxwell's equations, not according to Bushido code or warrior spirit or national determination. The Americans had mastered those equations, had built weapon systems based on their implications, had turned invisible radiation into a guidance system for destruction. The Japanese had trusted in their equipment without mastering the underlying science, had operated radio transmitters without understanding that every signal was a potential death sentence. And when the bombs followed those signals down through the darkness, when the white phosphorus turned jungle command posts into crematoriums, when the last transmission ended in fire and silence, in those terminal moments, the Type 94 radio transmitter completed its transformation from tool of command into monument to the inadequacy of courage alone in an age of industrial warfare. The lesson written in those flames remains legible today. That modern war is fought not just by soldiers, but by societies, not just with weapons, but with scientific understanding, not just through battlefield tactics, but through technological and industrial foundations laid decades before the first shot is fired. The terrified Japanese officers, their fingers frozen over Morse keys they knew might kill them, understood this truth too late. Their fear, their hesitation, their terrible choice between silence and self-betrayal. These were the wages of entering the 20th century's most advanced war, without the 21st century's most advanced capabilities. And the radio waves they transmitted, invisible and indifferent, carried their final messages into a sky that had learned to listen, to locate, to kill with mechanical precision. The sky that belonged not to the brave, but to those who had most thoroughly weaponized the invisible spectrum of electromagnetic radiation. In that sky, American bombers circled through darkness, their receivers glowing softly, waiting patiently for the next transmission, the next signal, the next glowing invitation written in radio waves that would guide the bombs home to men who had learned, far too late, that the air itself had become their enemy.